In the grand kingdom of Alden Moor, where marble corridors whispered old secrets and torchlight danced on gold leaf ceilings, there lived a prince who was never supposed to shine. Prince Donald was the son of a concubine, a warm, laughing woman his father had once loved, then forgotten like a song whose name escapes you. By the palace rules as sacred as stone, Donald could never inherit the throne. He sat at the far edge of every feast, dressed in royal silks that felt like borrowed clothes. But the servants whispered differently. They had watched all three princes grow. Adam ruled with the cold efficiency of a man who had decided very early what the world owed him. Smith trailed behind Adam like smoke behind fire. But Donald was the one who remembered their names, who sat beside the stable boy when he wept over a dead horse, who asked the cook about her ailing mother. "There is something wrong with that boy," Adam once told Smith, watching Donald laugh with a kitchen servant. "He has no idea what he is." Prince Adam in the Eastern Corridor. And so the brothers went to work. Every tale that reached King Dennis's ear about Donald was shaped like a wound. A letter of complaint here, a whispered disgrace there. The young prince was made to seem reckless, embarrassing, unworthy of the royal name, and King Dennis, too proud to look with his own eyes, believed every word. She had arrived as a young girl, a mute palace made with large, watchful eyes the color of autumn bark. She could not speak. She could not defend herself when the other servants teased her, or when Adam and Smith called her slow-witted and ugly, snapping their fingers at her as though she were a stray dog wandering where it did not belong. They knocked trays from her hands and laughed at her silence. They mimicked her muteness in cruel pantomime for the amusement of courtiers. Nobody stopped them. Nobody spoke for someone who could not speak for herself. Nobody except Donald. One afternoon, Smith had cornered Lila near the linen corridor, snatching her veil and parading it before a cluster of laughing courtiers. Donald appeared from the far end of the hall. He said nothing dramatic. He simply walked to Smith, took back the veil, folded it gently, and placed it in Lila's hands. Then he turned to his brother with eyes quiet as a winter lake and said, "Touch her things again, and I will make certain father hears exactly who you are when no one important is watching." Smith laughed, but he never touched Lila's things again. Lila would lift her gaze to Donald in those moments with an expression that had no word in the palace's many tongues, something between gratitude and recognition, as if she had found the one person in that gleaming fortress who could see past silence to the soul beneath it. Years passed. Donald grew into a man of quiet brilliance, managing the eastern granaries so well that 3 provinces stopped going hungry, negotiating a river dispute that the king's own advisors had abandoned. People spoke of him in market squares, not as a forgotten prince, but as a name worth knowing. This terrified Adam. One night, behind the carved mahogany doors of Adam's chamber, the 2 brothers hatched their most elegant cruelty yet. They had noticed, over the years, something that no one else had bothered to observe, that Donald watched over the mute maid, that his jaw tightened whenever she was mocked, that he made sure she ate when the senior servants shorted her portions. Perfect, Adam thought. Every man has his softness. This is his. They went to King Dennis with voices dripping with concern. Their useless, embarrassing half-brother, they said, had become attached to the mute maid. It was a scandal waiting to happen. But, and here Adam smiled his most devoted smile, perhaps the kindest solution was to simply let them marry. Settle Donald somewhere far from court. Give him a small estate. Let him live out his harmless life away from the palace. He could never inherit anyway. King Dennis clasped his hands together with undisguised relief. He had always found Donald's very existence a quiet, nagging embarrassment, a reminder of a chapter in his life he preferred to leave unread. A marriage, a departure, a clean ending. See to it that it is arranged before the harvest season. Quietly, no fanfare. But before the arrangement was made official, Adam found Lila alone in the garden at dusk. He crouched before her, the first time he had ever addressed her as though she were a person, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. You will marry the prince. And if he refuses, if either of you make this difficult, I will ensure you disappear from this palace in a way no one will question. Do you understand me? Lila stared at him. She could not speak, but her eyes said everything a voice would have fumbled. Donald was told next. He stood very still when Adam delivered the news with theatrical sympathy. He looked at his brother for a long time. Then he thought of Lila, of every bruise she had swallowed in silence, of every cruelty she had endured in that palace. And he thought, if there is one thing I can do for her, it is to take her away from here. He agreed to the marriage. There was no celebration, no garlands in the royal hall, no banquet. The wedding was done in the small chapel beside the servants' quarters, witnessed by 2 sleepy clerks and a candle that nearly guttered out before the vows were complete. Adam and Smith watched from a distance, satisfied as men who have just moved a piece off a game board. They were sent to Elm Vale, a modest estate 3 days' ride from the capital, at the edge of a green valley where sheep outnumbered people and the wind smelled of pine and rain. Adam had chosen it for its obscurity, but obscurity, it turned out, has very good acoustics. Donald set about building a life with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. He repaired the estate's crumbling east wall. He learned the names of every tenant farmer. He sat with Lila in the evenings, and they communicated the way people do when words are absent, through gesture, expression, the language of attention. It was on a morning in late autumn, 3 months after their arrival, that it happened. Donald had gone to the valley before sunrise to check on the river boundary. Lila was alone in the kitchen, kneading bread in the pale gray light, when something shifted in her throat, like a door that had been sealed for decades, suddenly finding its hinges again. She opened her mouth, and from it came a sound, not a word, not at first, a note, pure and unhurried as water finding its level. It rose through the kitchen, through the half-open window, and dissolved into the morning air. The chickens in the yard went still. The old hound by the fireplace lifted his head. When Donald returned and found her standing in the middle of the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, hands dusted with flour, and her mouth open, singing, he set down his coat and did not move for a very long time. The first word she ever spoke, her voice, when it came fully, was something the world had no right to expect. It was low and gold and deep as a church bell's echo, yet it could climb into registers that made the air feel thinner, more precious. It did not merely sound beautiful. It felt like something, like grief made bearable, like longing given a home, like standing in rain and choosing not to run from it. When she finally looked at Donald and spoke her first word aloud, a single whispered, "Thank you," he sat down on the kitchen floor and wept like a man who had just witnessed something sacred. It started small, as all great things do. A tenant farmer's wife, passing beneath the estate's open window at dusk, stopped walking, then stopped breathing, then stood with her hand pressed against her chest until the song inside ended, and she walked home changed in some way she couldn't explain to her husband, but would remember until she was very old. She told her neighbor. The neighbor told the market told the road told everyone it met. Within a season, travelers were altering their routes to pass through Elm Vale, not for trade, not for scenery, for the voice that came from the valley estate, The voice of the woman they called the songbird of Elm Vale, whose melodies, they said, could unknot the tightest grief, quiet a crying child 3 rooms away, and make old men remember who they had been before life made them hard. A merchant from the capital swore she had cured his sleeplessness with a single lullaby sung through a window. A general, passing through on campaign, requested she sing for his exhausted troops, and wrote in his journal that night, "They slept better than they have in years." Whatever that woman carries in her voice, it is not of this ordinary world. The stories reach the capital like smoke reaching a window. It cannot help but seep through. They reached Adam first. The mute girl? Singing. Adam stared at his informant for a long moment. "You must mean someone else." But it was not someone else. Invitations were sent to Elm Vale, first politely, then with increasing urgency. Would the songbird of Elm Vale consider performing at the Prince's Autumn Gala? At the New Year's Court? At the Festival of the Founding? Each envelope bore an impressive seal. Each one was declined. Lila had not forgotten the dusk garden. She had not forgotten the crouching prince and his whispered threat. She had not forgotten what those palace walls had felt like against her back when cruelty arrived in royal clothing. She had a life now, a real one, with a husband who loved her, a valley that called her name in the wind, and a voice she was only beginning to discover the edges of. She owed that palace nothing. King Dennis heard about the voice in his 58th year, during a particularly tedious court dinner at which 4 different nobles described, independently and at length, what they had witnessed at Elm Vale. He was a man who had learned to tune out exaggeration, but something in the consistency of their accounts made him set down his goblet. That night, he sent a private writer. Not a royal summons, just a letter, written in his own hand, from a father to a son he had dismissed too easily and too long ago. He asked if he might visit. Donald read the letter twice, then showed it to Lila. She took it, read it once, and nodded. That was enough. King Dennis arrived at Elm Vale on a gray morning with a modest escort and without announcement. He had expected modest. He had not expected the quiet dignity of the place, the well-tended fields, the farmers who greeted Donald by name with genuine warmth, the children who ran to the gate not in fear of a royal visit, but in excitement for the prince they simply liked. He had not expected the man his son had become. And then Lila sang. She sang after supper in the small lamplit hall of the estate, with no audience but a king, his son, and the deep Elm Vale night pressing at the windows. She sang one song, a slow, aching melody she had composed herself, about a woman who had been silent so long she forgot she had something to say, and then remembered. King Dennis, a man who had not wept publicly since his coronation, did not weep publicly now. But when she finished, he sat for a very long time with his hands folded over his mouth, and his eyes were wet in the lamplight, and no one in the room pretended otherwise. Later, walking with Donald in the night garden, the king said quietly, "I was told you were an embarrassment to this family." Donald looked at his father. "I know," he said simply. The silence between them held years of wasted time. King Dennis put a hand on his son's shoulder, perhaps the first time he had touched Donald with gentleness and intention. "I was a fool," he said, "and I was lied to by men I should have seen through. Forgive an old king." When Adam and Smith heard that the king had made a private visit to Elm Vale, had sat in the estate's modest hall and wept at the mute maid's voice, the palace corridor felt colder than it had before. Adam was the first to request an audience with Lila, directly. He traveled to Elm Vale himself this time. No intermediary, no sealed letter, arriving at the estate gate on an overcast afternoon with his best coat and his most carefully arranged face. Lila met him in the garden. He had expected the mute girl. He had expected someone he could manage, flatter maneuver. What he found instead was a woman who stood in the dappled light of an afternoon she owned completely, with clear eyes that had seen him at his worst and forgotten nothing. Adam opened his mouth and found, for the first time in his life, that he did not know what to say. Every sentence he had rehearsed felt suddenly absurd. The well-worn phrases of a man apologizing not because he was sorry, but because the world had shifted and he needed to be on the right side of it. He said, "I treated you shamefully." Lila looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was warm and low and carried none of the bitterness he deserved, "Yes, you did." And she turned and walked back toward the house without hurry, without malice, without the need to say anything more. Adam stood at the garden gate with the full weight of it settling over him. Not the shame of being caught, but the deeper, less forgivable shame of understanding, too late, what he had done to her. What she had endured in those palace hallways. What she had been all along, while he had wasted his contempt on her. Smith came separately a week later. He sat in the estate's front room and looked at his hands for a long time before he could speak. When he finally did, he did not try to excuse anything. He said only, "I was cruel because it was easy. I think about it now and I cannot tell you that I understand myself." Lila brought him tea. She sat across from him and let him talk. And when he left, something in his chest had loosened. Not absolution, not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of the long work of becoming a better man. He would carry the memory of that mute girl flinching in palace corridors for the rest of his life. He would let it be the weight that kept him honest. In the year that followed, King Dennis summoned Donald back to court, not to reclaim a title, not to undo what could not be undone, but to stand before the full assembly of lords and say plainly what he had come to know, that his most overlooked son had become, without fanfare or permission, the finest man in the kingdom. He restored Donald's honor publicly. He named him High Steward of the Eastern Provinces, a role that carried no throne but all the work that mattered, the granaries, the rivers, the people who ate because someone had bothered to care. Donald accepted it the way he accepted everything, with quiet grace, and without the need to make anyone feel small in the doing of it. And Lila sang at the winter solstice ceremony that year, in the great hall of the palace where she had once scrubbed floors in silence while princes mocked her. She stood at the center of that shining room in deep burgundy cloth, and she sang the same song she had sung to the king by lamplight in Elm Vale, and the entire court went silent in the way that only great truth can silence a room. She sang about being invisible, about carrying a gift in a place that would not let you use it, about the man who had stood between her and the world's cruelty again and again, because it was simply the right thing to do. About the morning a voice came back to a woman who had almost forgotten it was ever hers. They said, for years afterward, that you could hear the king weeping from the corridor. That Adam stood very straight and very still, the way men stand, when they are trying not to fall apart in public. That Smith left the hall before it ended and did not explain why. That Donald held his wife's hand through the whole of it, and smiled the smile of a man who had always known exactly who she was,